She didn't know his name. She didn't know that the iron gates she'd just driven through belonged to a man who controlled half the underground empire on the East Coast. She didn't know that the last 3 women who'd gotten close to him had all walked away, not because he'd hurt them, but because the moment they saw what his life really looked like, they couldn't run fast enough. All Finley Dawson knew was that a grown woman in designer heels was about to shove a little girl in a flower dress, and that wasn't something she could walk past. She was 27, a single mother working double delivery shifts just to keep the lights on in a fifth-floor walk-up in Bushwick, and she hadn't had a full night's sleep in 4 years. She had flour under her nails and a second-hand jacket that didn't quite keep out the cold. She had nothing, no degree, no savings, no family to call if things went wrong. But she had a voice, and she used it. "Don't touch that child!" The woman in heels turned slowly, her eyes sharp enough to cut glass. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "I don't care who you are," Finley said, stepping between her and the girl. "You don't put your hands on a kid." That earned her a slap hard enough to turn her head sideways. The woman's diamond ring left a thin line of fire across her cheekbone. Finley didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just knelt down, looked at the little girl, and said, "Are you okay, sweetheart?" The girl stared at her with gray-blue eyes, far too old for 8 years old, and whispered, "You're the first person who's ever done that." What Finley didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this child wasn't the housekeeper's daughter. She was the secret heir to the Ashford Empire, raised overseas, and hidden from every enemy her father had ever made. She'd just returned without telling anyone, disguised in a simple dress, to judge the woman her father was about to marry, and in less than 60 seconds, she'd already made her decision. Not about the fiancé, about Finley, miles away from the estate, inside the silent cabin of his moving sedan. Vincent Ashford watched the live security feed on an encrypted tablet. 36 years old, a jaw that looked carved from stone, and eyes so cold they made grown men forget how to speak. He ran a financial empire in daylight, and something far darker after sunset. He hadn't smiled in 6 years, not since the night his wife was killed in a hit meant for him, not since he'd put his 2-year-old daughter on a private jet to Geneva and told himself it was the only way to keep her alive. He'd buried every soft thing inside him after that. He wore his cruelty like armor. He made decisions that destroyed men without ever raising his voice. And right now, watching a delivery woman in a worn-out jacket stand between his fiancé and his daughter without a single tremor in her hands, Vincent Ashford felt something he hadn't felt in years. He didn't have a word for it yet, but his daughter did. She'd already chosen. If you're hooked, smash that like button so this story reaches more listeners. Share it with someone who loves a good plot twist, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Let's return to the moment Finley stepped through those iron gates. A single action that set off a chain of events no one could have foreseen. That afternoon, when Vincent Ashford's black car rolled through the gates of the mansion, Orrin was already waiting on the front steps. The 42-year-old former Special Forces operative, the only man in the world who dared to look Vincent straight in the eye without lowering his head, said only one sentence. "She is exactly where the feed showed her to be." Vincent strode into the living room, his heart hammering against his ribs for the first time in 6 years. Zoe was sitting on the gray velvet sofa, her feet not touching the floor, an open book resting on her lap. She looked up, her gray-blue eyes exactly like his, and said in a voice so calm it seemed to make the whole room stop breathing. "Hello, Father." Vincent Ashford, the man who made the entire East Coast keep its distance, the man who hadn't revealed even the smallest crack of emotion to anyone in 6 years, dropped to his knees, right there in the middle of the living room. His 2 hands held his daughter's face, his fingers trembling faintly, and he couldn't say a single word for nearly a minute. Zoe wrapped her arms around her father's neck. "I missed you. Why did you come home without telling me?" His voice had gone hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "Because you would have said it wasn't safe yet. You always say it isn't safe yet." Vincent looked toward Orrin, who stood in the doorway. Orrin shrugged. "She's more persuasive than any lawyer I've ever met, sir." Vincent didn't blame Orrin. He couldn't. Because his daughter was here, right in front of his eyes, in flesh and blood, after 6 years in which he had only been able to see her through a video call screen once a week. He held Zoe one more time before finally standing. After that, when father and daughter sat side by side in the study, Zoe told him. She didn't recount what had happened in the hallway because she knew her father had watched the camera footage. She told him what the camera couldn't record. When she knelt down and asked if I was all right, Zoe said, her voice slow, choosing each word with care. Her eyes weren't afraid. She wasn't afraid of that woman. She wasn't afraid of getting fired. She wasn't afraid of anything. She only looked at me. Zoe paused for a beat. It's been a very long time since anyone looked at me like that, Father. Vincent didn't answer, but his jaw clenched hard. He picked up the internal phone and called Paige into the study. The conversation lasted no more than 10 minutes. No one heard what was said, but when the door opened, Paige Whitmore stepped out with a bloodless face and both hands clenched tightly at the sides of her dress. She didn't look at anyone, went straight upstairs to her private room, and slammed the door shut. That night, after Zoe had fallen asleep, Vincent sat alone in his study and gave Oren an order. The delivery girl from this afternoon. Name, address, background, from date of birth to the present. I want everything before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The next morning, a thin file lay on the desk. Oren had worked all night. Finley Dawson, 27 years old, born in Queens. Her mother died of cancer when she was 16. Her father left when she was still small. No information available. After her mother's death, she entered New York City's foster care system, moving through 3 families in 2 years before she came of age and had to stand on her own. High school graduate, no college degree, a long employment history, but all low-wage jobs. Waitress, convenience store cashier, delivery worker. Currently working 2 shifts for a delivery company in Brooklyn. Living in a 5th-floor studio apartment with no elevator in Bushwick. 1 son, Benjamin Dawson, 4 years old, single mother, no financial support from anyone. Vincent turned to the next page and stopped. The child's father, Tristan Mercer. He read that name twice. Mercer, the son of Hugh Mercer, the former financial advisor to the Ashford family, once the closest man to Vincent's father. 5 years ago, Hugh had betrayed the family, stolen $40 million, and vanished without a trace. Vincent had hunted him for 5 years and had found nothing. And now, the file showed that Tristan had left Finley at the exact time Hugh disappeared. He hadn't left her because he had stopped loving her. He had run after his father, abandoning the woman carrying his child without looking back. Vincent closed the file. His finger tapped lightly against the surface of the desk, an old habit whenever he was calculating. Finley Dawson had tangled roots, reaching toward the greatest enemy of his life. By the instinct of a boss, he should keep her under control. But every piece of data pointed to the same conclusion. She knew nothing. She was only another victim of the man who had run away. A knock sounded at the door. Zoe walked in, still wearing her pajamas, her hair slightly messy, but her eyes completely awake. She climbed onto the leather chair across from her father's desk, sat with her back straight, her 2 legs swinging because they didn't reach the floor. "Did you find the delivery girl, Father?" Vincent looked at his daughter. "Why do you care about her so much?" Zoe tilted her head, thought for a while, then answered. "Because yesterday there were 3 grown-ups there. That woman wanted to push me. Mrs. Webb hadn't reached me yet. Only she stepped in." The little girl stopped. "She didn't even know who I was, Father. She protected me not because I'm your daughter. She did it because I'm a child." Vincent looked at his daughter, the 8-year-old girl who spoke with a logic sharper than most advisors he had ever hired, and he understood that Zoe wasn't merely asking her father to invite a stranger into their home. She was beginning a game whose moves even he had not yet fully seen. 2 days later, Finley was delivering the last order of her afternoon shift in the Upper East Side when a black SUV pulled up to the curb right in front of her. The car door opened. Oren stepped out, tall, broad, his face expressionless, wearing a dark coat even though the weather wasn't all that cold. He handed her a white envelope with no sender's name on it. "Mr. Ashford wants to see you." Finley looked at the envelope, then looked back at Oren. "I don't know any Mr. Ashford. The owner of the house where you made a delivery 2 days ago? The place where you were slapped." Finley went rigid. She remembered the slap at once, remembered the diamond ring cutting into her cheekbone, remembered the gray-blue eyes of that little girl, looking at her as though she were the first person in the world who had ever dared to stand on her side. "He wants to compensate you for what happened that day," Oren said. And his daughter wants to see you again. His daughter, Finley hesitated. The instinct, sharpened by years of surviving on her own, told her this was a trap. Normal people didn't send black SUVs to invite a delivery girl somewhere. Normal people didn't have iron gates 3 meters high and security cameras everywhere. I'm not interested, she said. Thank you, but I don't need any compensation. She turned away, climbed into the old delivery van, and drove back to Brooklyn. Orrin didn't follow. He only stood there watching the van disappear at the end of the street, then took out his phone and called. She refused. That night, Finley got back to her apartment in Bushwick close to 9 o'clock. She climbed 5 flights of stairs, each step creaking beneath her feet. She opened the door. The neighbor who had watched Benny for her had gone home long ago, leaving the little boy asleep on the old sofa in front of the television, which was still on. Finley carried her son into bed, tucked the blanket around him, and kissed Benny on the forehead. Then she opened the refrigerator. 1 nearly empty carton of milk, 2 eggs, half a loaf of bread. She closed the refrigerator again, stood with her back against the kitchen wall, and shut her eyes. She didn't know where next month's rent was going to come from. Benny's daycare had sent a notice that the fees were going up. Winter was coming, and the heating system in this building broke down for at least 2 weeks every year. She opened the envelope again, the one Orrin had slipped into her hand before she had a chance to refuse. Inside was only a white card, printed with a brief line, a name, the mansion's address, and a phone number. No flowery words, no explanation. She looked at Benny sleeping, looked at the cracked wall on the ceiling, looked at the work shoes whose soles had worn thin. Then she picked up her phone and called. The next morning, Finley came to the Ashford mansion for the second time. This time, she passed through the main gate and was led by a security employee into the living room. And this time, she met him. Vincent Ashford stood beside the large window, his back turned to her. When he turned around, Finley understood at once why the room felt different when he entered it. It wasn't because he was threatening. He didn't look at her with threatening eyes. But there was something in the way he occupied space, the way the light seemed to step aside for him, the way everything in the room became background when he was the center. It wasn't charm, it was power, the kind of power that didn't need to show off because it had already soaked into every gesture. Thank you for coming, Miss Dawson. His voice was deep, each syllable held under control. I want to thank you for what happened the other day with my daughter. I only did what anyone should have done, Finley replied. You'd be surprised how many people haven't, he said. Then he went straight to the point. Zoe needed a tutor while she was in America. The little girl couldn't attend school for security reasons. Vincent didn't need someone with a teaching degree. He needed someone Zoe trusted. The job included a place to live inside the mansion for her and her son, a salary 5 times higher than her current delivery income, and all living expenses covered. Finley wanted to say no. She opened her mouth to say no. But at that exact moment, the living room door opened, and Zoe ran in. The little girl didn't run to her father. She ran straight to Finley, wrapped her arms around her waist, and pressed her face into Finley's stomach. You came back! Vincent stood still. He looked at his daughter, the child he had protected for 6 years with distance, with high walls and security codes. The child who hadn't allowed any nanny in Switzerland to come near her, now hugging a strange woman she had met exactly 1 time. Finley looked down at Zoe, then looked up at Vincent, and she said, When do I start? 3 days later, Finley and Benny moved into the mansion. Everything the mother and son owned fit into 2 small suitcases. Mrs. Webb, the mansion's housekeeper, led them to their room in the side wing. The room was larger than their entire apartment in Bushwick, with a big window overlooking the garden, a bed covered in clean white sheets, and a small table beside the window holding a vase of fresh flowers. Benny stood in the middle of the room, his eyes round with wonder, turned in a circle and asked, Mommy, are we staying here forever? Finley hadn't had time to answer when Zoe appeared in the doorway. The little girl looked at Benny, and Benny looked at Zoe. No adult introduction was needed. Zoe held out her hand. Do you want to see the garden? There are squirrels. Benny took Zoe's hand and ran off without looking back. Finley stood alone in the new room, listening to her son's laughter fade down the hallway. She stepped to the window and looked out over the vast grounds. The perfectly trimmed lawn, the iron fence in the distance, the security cameras mounted at every corner, almost invisible unless you knew to look. the men in dark suits patrolling along the stone paths, and the silence. Not the peaceful silence of the suburbs. This was organized silence, controlled silence, as though every sound in this house had to ask permission before it was allowed to exist. Finley didn't know what kind of world she had just stepped into. But she knew one thing: her son was laughing, and it had been a very long time since she had heard that laughter ring out like that. On her first day as a tutor, Finley realized she didn't have a single advantage. She didn't have a teaching degree, didn't have a curriculum, didn't have classroom experience. All she had was a library as large as the entire ground floor of her old apartment in Bushwick, and an 8-year-old girl sitting across from her, gray-blue eyes watching her, as if grading every movement she made. The library of the Ashford mansion ran the full length of the eastern hallway, with bookshelves reaching all the way to the ceiling, filled with old leather-bound covers. Finley chose the simplest approach she knew. She asked Zoe what she wanted to learn. "Up to you," Zoe replied, folding her arms. "You're the tutor." Finley didn't rush. She took an American history book down from the shelf, opened to a chapter about the first migrants, and began telling it instead of teaching it. She told it like a story, not like reading a lesson. Zoe didn't interrupt, but the little girl's eyes gradually changed from probing to truly attentive. At the end of the session, Zoe asked, "Where did you study?" "Public school in Queens. After that, I taught myself." "Taught yourself?" "Public libraries are free, Zoe. You only need to know how to find the right shelf." Zoe nodded and made no further comment. But the next day, she was already sitting in the library before Finley arrived. In the days that followed, Zoe began asking more questions, but not about history or books. She asked about Finley. "Where's your mother?" "My mother died when I was 16. "Why?" "Illness. Cancer." "Then who did you live with?" "The state. Foster care. 3 families in 2 years." Zoe was silent for a moment. "Were they good?" Finley looked at the little girl. She could lie, could soften it, could paint it in gentler colors. But Zoe's eyes were not the eyes of a child who needed to be protected from the truth. Those eyes had lost a mother at 2 years old, had lived away from her father for 6 years, had flown alone from Geneva back to America without telling anyone. "The first family was all right," Finley said. "The second family wasn't. I stayed with the third family until I turned 18, then went out on my own." "What about Benny's father?" The question came fast and clean, like a bullet. Finley didn't dodge it. "He left when I was pregnant. He never came back." "Are you angry?" "I used to be. I'm not now, because if he'd stayed, I might have suffered even more." Zoe looked at Finley for a long time, then turned back to the book she had been reading and didn't ask anything else. But from that day on, the way the little girl spoke to Finley changed, softer, less challenging, as if she had found the answer she needed. Meanwhile, Benny adjusted faster than anyone had imagined. The 4-year-old boy followed Zoe from morning until night, calling Sister Zoe in a shrill voice full of excitement every time she appeared. Zoe had never had a younger sibling. She had grown up alone in Switzerland, used to nannies who changed with the seasons, used to the silence of rooms far too large for one child. Benny was something she hadn't known she was missing until she had him. She led Benny through the garden to look at squirrels, read books to him in English touched with French, patiently taught him to count from 1 to 10, then counted again when he forgot the number 7. Finley watched the 2 children from the library window and felt something tighten in her chest. It had been a very long time since she had seen Benny allowed to play like a normal child, instead of sitting alone in front of the television in a cramped apartment, waiting for his mother to come home from work. But the Ashford mansion didn't hold only the laughter of children. On the 4th night, Finley woke close to 2 o'clock in the morning because Benny turned over in his sleep. She tucked in the blanket around her son again, then stepped into the hallway to get some water. The hallway was long, dimly lit, absolutely silent. But light spilled from the crack beneath the door of Vincent's study at the end of the corridor. Finley didn't mean to look, but the door was open just enough for her to see. Vincent was sitting in the leather chair behind his desk, with no computer open, no phone in his hand. In front of him, on the desk, was a photograph in a silver frame. The woman in the picture was young, beautiful, with dark hair and a wide smile. Madeline. Finley knew because she had seen the family portrait hanging in the second-floor hallway. But in this small photograph, Madeline wasn't standing beside Vincent the way she did in the official portrait. She was laughing, looking into the camera, alive, and Vincent was looking at that photograph with a face Finley had never seen before. The face that by day seemed carved from cold stone, the face that made grown men forget how to speak, now in the darkness of 2 o'clock in the morning, carried a grief so naked that it made Finley step back. He wasn't crying. He was only sitting there, silent, one hand resting on the frame, as if the woman in the picture would disappear one more time if he let go. Finley turned away. She went back to her room, closed the door gently, and lay down on the bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. She had thought Vincent Ashford was stone, steel, the kind of man who had nothing inside him except orders and power. But tonight she had seen the truth. He was a man who still sat before his wife's photograph at 2 o'clock in the morning, 6 years after she died, still not knowing how to let go. Zoe Ashford was 8 years old, but she had already understood something most adults spent a lifetime failing to realize. If you want to change someone, don't tell them they need to change. Put them in a situation where they change on their own without even noticing. She had observed enough. After nearly a week in the mansion, she had seen the way Finley spoke to Benny, seen the way she answered every question directly, without circling around it, seen the way she looked at Madeline's portrait in the second-floor hallway without curiosity or fear, only with quiet respect. And the little girl had seen her father, too. She had seen how Vincent found excuses to pass by the library whenever Finley was teaching. She had seen how he stopped at the door, didn't come in, only stood there listening for a few seconds before continuing on. She had seen how every evening he asked Mrs. Webb, "Do Miss Dawson and the boy need anything?" but had never once asked Finley directly. Her father didn't know how to get close to other people anymore. He had forgotten, so Zoe would help him remember. On Saturday morning, Zoe found Finley in the library. "Do you know how to make pancakes?" "Yes. Why?" "I want to learn. Can you teach me?" "In the big kitchen," Finley agreed. And 10 minutes later, when the two of them and Benny were standing in the mansion's vast kitchen, Zoe ran off and came back with Vincent. "Father, Finley is teaching me how to make pancakes. Can you help?" Vincent looked at his daughter, then looked into the kitchen, where Finley was standing in front of the stove with a bowl of batter, her hair tied up, Mrs. Webb's apron wrapped around her body so loosely it looked oversized. He hadn't stepped into his own kitchen since Madeline was still alive. "I don't know how to make pancakes, Zoe. That's why you need to learn." The little girl took her father's hand and pulled him forward, and Vincent Ashford, the man who controlled an underground empire stretching from New York to Boston, let an 8-year-old child lead him into the kitchen without resisting. Finley looked up when she saw Vincent walk in. She blinked, but said nothing, only pushed an egg toward him. "Crack that into the bowl for me." Vincent picked up the egg and looked at it as if it were a strange weapon he had never been trained to use. He tapped it against the edge of the bowl. Too hard. The shell shattered. The yolk ran over his hand, and pieces of shell fell into the batter. Benny burst out laughing. "You broke the egg!" Vincent looked down at the yolk on his hand, then looked at Benny holding his stomach as he laughed, then looked at Finley, who was trying not to laugh and wasn't succeeding very well. "Try again," Finley said, handing him a second egg. "More gently. You don't need to destroy it." The second time was better. Only 2 pieces of shell fell into the bowl. Finley made him fish them out with a spoon while she mixed the batter. Zoe stood beside her father, teaching him how to stir evenly, her voice serious as if she were guiding a surgical procedure. Benny demanded to help sprinkle flour onto the pan, but instead sprinkled it onto his own face. White flour covered both of the little boy's cheeks, clung to his eyebrows, even got into his ears. He looked down at his flour-covered hands, then looked up at everyone, laughing so hard he nearly fell off the stool he was standing on. Zoe laughed with him. Her laughter was completely different from her usual voice, which was far too mature. It was clear. It was the right age. It was the laughter of an 8-year-old child, allowed to be an 8-year-old child. Vincent stood in the middle of the kitchen, his hands sticky with flour and egg yolk, watching his daughter laugh. And the corner of his mouth, for the first time in a very long while, lifted. Not a smile, not yet. But it was a sign that somewhere inside the wall he had built for 6 years, one brick had just shifted loose. Outside the kitchen door, Mrs. Webb stood silently. She had served as housekeeper of this mansion for 20 years, since Vincent's father was still alive. She looked at the scene in the kitchen, then turned to Orrin standing beside her and whispered, "The last time I heard laughter in this kitchen was when Mrs. Madeline was still here." Orrin didn't answer, but he looked into the kitchen, looked at Vincent, awkwardly flipping a scorched pancake, while Zoe criticized her father for not being as skilled as Finley, and even this 42-year-old former Special Forces operative had to turn his face away for a second. Finley didn't hear what Mrs. Webb had said. She was busy wiping flour off Benny's face with a wet towel, while Zoe argued with Vincent that pancakes were not allowed to be black. But she saw Vincent in that moment, holding the pan, his face slightly bewildered, the cuffs of his dress shirt rolled up and dusted with flour, and she thought this was a completely different man from the one who had sat alone before his wife's photograph at 2 o'clock in the morning. In the kitchen, among flour and laughter and a burned pancake, he wasn't a boss. He wasn't darkness. He was only a father learning again how to be beside his daughter, and he was clumsy enough to be almost pitiful. He was also an ordinary person, and that thought, Finley realized, was more dangerous than any iron gate or security camera in this mansion. Paige Whitmore wasn't someone easily defeated. She had lived in the underworld long enough to know that power didn't belong to whoever shouted the loudest, but to whoever knew how to wait for the right moment to strike. And she had waited long enough. On the Monday morning immediately following the pancake scene in the kitchen, Paige stood in her private room in the west wing of the mansion, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and sharp. "Father, she's putting down roots." Grant Whitmore was silent for a few seconds on the other end of the line. At 62 years old, he controlled the entire shipping route from Boston down through New England, and he hadn't kept that position by being reckless. The delivery girl? The delivery girl is now a tutor, living in the house, eating at the same table, playing with the little girl. Yesterday, I saw Vincent standing in the kitchen making pancakes with her. Grant sighed on the other end. "Handle it cleanly. Don't touch her. Touching her leaves marks. Remove her by making her unnecessary." Paige understood at once. That afternoon, a luxury car stopped in front of the mansion. A woman of about 40 stepped out, her hair pinned neatly, silver-framed glasses on her face, carrying a brown leather briefcase and a thick set of lesson materials. Catherine Holt, a private tutor from Manhattan, with a master's degree in education from Columbia and 15 years of experience teaching the children of billionaires. Paige led her into the living room and introduced her to Vincent before dinner. "I think Zoe deserves to be taught by someone with real, professional qualifications," Paige said, her voice gentle, reasonable, without a single word anyone could challenge. "Miss Dawson is very kind, but she doesn't have credentials. Zoe needs more than that." Vincent didn't answer immediately. He looked at Paige, then looked at Catherine Holt, who was sitting upright on the sofa with a professional smile, then nodded. Let her try one session. The next morning, Catherine Holt sat down at the library table, laid out her curriculum, opened her laptop, and began her first lesson with Zoe. Zoe walked in, looked at the strange woman sitting in the place where Finley usually sat, looked at the lesson materials on the table, looked at the empty chair beside the bookshelf, where Benny often sat scribbling while Sister Zoe studied. Benny wasn't there. Finley wasn't there. Zoe pulled out the chair, sat down, folded both arms across her chest, and didn't open her mouth. Catherine Holt smiled professionally. "Zoe, today we'll begin with silence. What subject do you like best? Math, science, or silence? All right, perhaps we'll read a passage together first. Silence." 45 minutes passed. Zoe didn't say a word. She didn't look at the book. She didn't look at Catherine. The little girl sat motionless, her eyes fixed straight out the window, her arms folded like a small statue carved from stone. Catherine Holt, who had taught the children of senators and investment bank directors, walked out of the library with her face flushed red and said to Mrs. Webb, "I've never encountered a case like this." Paige heard the news, her lips pressed tight, but she hadn't given up. Give it one more day. Children need time to adjust. The second day, the result was exactly the same. Zoe sat, arms folded, silent. She didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't cry. She simply refused to exist inside that lesson. That evening, Vincent called Zoe into the study. The little girl walked in, climbed onto the familiar leather chair across from her father's desk, her legs swinging. "Why won't you cooperate with Miss Holt? I don't like her. You haven't given her a chance." "I don't need a chance to know what I want, Father." Vincent looked at his daughter. His voice was still calm, but there was a trace of hardness in it now. "Zoe, I need you to explain more clearly." Zoe stopped swinging her legs. She looked straight into her father's eyes, and when she spoke, her voice wasn't angry, wasn't childish, only so clear that it cut into the silence like a blade. "You let other people decide for me without asking me a single question. Exactly the same way you let other people decide who you should marry." The study sank into silence. Vincent looked at his daughter. Sina, Key, 8 years old, sitting in a chair far too large for her small body, her feet not touching the floor, but those gray-blue eyes looked at him without blinking. That sentence wasn't about a tutor. They both knew it wasn't about a tutor. He didn't answer. Zoe didn't say anything more either. She slid down from the chair, walked to the door, and paused for one beat before stepping into the hallway. "Finley never decides for me. She asks me what I want to learn." Then the little girl left. The next morning, Catherine Holt received a thank you envelope with a generous check inside and was driven back to Manhattan. Paige stood at the second-floor window, watching that car leave through the gates, her fingers pressing hard into the windowsill. She had lost the first round, and her opponent wasn't Finley Dawson. Her opponent was an 8-year-old girl who knew how to play chess better than even her father. Everything happened on the 12th night after Finley moved into the mansion. Close to midnight, Benny began to cough. At first, they were only small, broken coughs, the kind of cough a 4-year-old child made after catching a chill. Finley pulled the blanket up to her son's chest and placed her hand on his forehead. Warm. She thought perhaps it would be all right. 1 hour later, Benny couldn't stop coughing. The cough was wet, heavy, dragged up from deep inside his chest. Finley turned on the light and touched her son's forehead again. Hot, much hotter than before. She lifted Benny into her arms, and the little boy opened his eyes in a daze, his face flushed red, his body limp in his mother's hands. "Mommy, I can't breathe." Finley held him, her heart beating wildly. She looked around the room. No car. She didn't have a vehicle of her own, and the delivery van had already been returned to her former employer when she took the tutoring job. The mansion sat in Upper Westchester, miles from the nearest town, a suburb with no taxis at night, no subway, nothing. She took out her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unlock the screen. Who should she call? 911? How long would it take an ambulance to reach this area? 20 minutes? 30? Benny coughed through another long fit, and this time he cried because he couldn't breathe. And that cry was what made Finley carry him and run out of the room before she had time to think. The hallway was dark, the lights dim. Finley ran barefoot, Benny in her arms, her hair tangled, her nightclothes wrinkled. She didn't know where she meant to go. She only knew her son had a fever, and she had no one. Then she slammed straight into Vincent. He was walking from the direction of the study back toward his bedroom, still in his shirt, holding a glass of liquor, clearly not yet asleep. The glass fell to the floor when Finley crashed into him. "Benny has a fever," she said, her voice choked, her eyes frantic. "A high fever. He can't stop coughing. I don't have a car. I don't know where the hospital is." Vincent didn't ask a single question. He placed his hand on Benny's forehead, felt the heat, then turned his head. Orrin, the former Special Forces operative, had already appeared at the end of the hallway, as if he never truly slept. "Car! Nearest children's hospital! Now!" Within 3 minutes, the black SUV was tearing out through the mansion gates. Orrin drove, cutting through the dark roads of Westchester. Vincent sat in the back seat with Finley. Benny lay in his mother's arms, breathing heavily, his eyes squeezed shut. Finley held her son tight, pressed back against the seat, unable to say anything except to repeat, "You'll be okay. You'll be okay. Mommy's here," in a voice so shaky even she couldn't quite believe herself. Vincent sat beside her, silent. He said nothing to comfort her. He didn't offer empty words like, "Everything would be fine." He only sat there, his hand resting on the back of the seat behind Finley, close but not touching, like a wall standing between her and the rest of the world. Westchester Medical Center, Pediatric Emergency Room, 3 o'clock in the morning. White neon lights, The smell of antiseptic, the steady beeping of monitors. The doctor examined Benny, diagnosed acute bronchitis, and said he needed to stay overnight for observation, fluids, and fever-reducing medication. Benny lay on the tiny hospital bed, an IV needle in his hand, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling. Finley sat on the plastic chair beside the bed, both hands wrapped tightly around her son's small hand. She didn't look at anyone. She only looked at Benny. And Vincent Ashford, the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast, the man whose name made the entire underworld keep its distance, sat on the plastic chair on the other side of the hospital bed, in the pediatric emergency room, at 3 o'clock in the morning, waiting for the doctor to examine a 4-year-old boy who wasn't his child. Oren stood in the hallway. No one entered the room except the nurses. Time passed with the slow heaviness of hospital time after midnight, every minute stretching as long as an hour. Benny slept. The fever medicine began to work. The coughing gradually grew less frequent. Finley still held her son's hand and didn't let go. Her shoulders trembled, not because she was cold. Then she cried. Without a sound, the tears only slipped down, silently, falling onto the back of her hand as she held Benny's. She hadn't cried when she was slapped. She hadn't cried when she moved into a stranger's house. She hadn't cried through 4 years of raising a child alone, working 2 shifts, eating 1 meal, and skipping the next. She had kept everything inside, pressed tight, locked away, because there had been no one to cry in front of, and what good was crying alone? But tonight, in the pediatric emergency room at 3 o'clock in the morning, looking at her son lying in a hospital bed with an IV in his hand, she couldn't hold it in anymore. "I have no one," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If anything happens to Benny, I have no one at all." Vincent stood. He took off his coat and placed it gently over Finley's shoulders. Not hurriedly, not dramatically, just a simple and precise gesture, the way he did everything. Then he sat down in the chair right beside her, closer than he had ever sat to her before, and said in a low voice, promising nothing flowery, only 3 words. "You have me." Finley didn't look at him. She still looked at Benny, but her shoulders stopped trembling, and she didn't push the coat away. They sat like that until morning, in the pediatric emergency room, beneath the white neon lights, beside the hospital bed of a 4-year-old boy, whose breathing was slowly becoming even again. No one said another word. But the wall Finley had built around herself for 4 years, the wall she had believed nothing could break, cracked that night. And the person who caused that crack didn't use strength, didn't use money, didn't use power. He only sat down beside her and stayed. Benny was discharged from the hospital after 2 days. The little boy returned to the mansion with a bottle of antibiotics, a nebulizer for his nose and throat, and twice as much clinginess to his mother as before. But the person who took care of Benny the most during those days of recovery wasn't Finley. It was Zoe. The 8-year-old girl turned Benny's room into a small world that the 4-year-old boy didn't want to leave. Zoe read books to Benny, choosing the ones with lots of pictures, holding up each page for him to see, and then making a different voice for every character. She taught Benny how to draw, or more accurately, the 2 children scribbled together on paper and took turns guessing what animal the other had drawn. Benny always lost because everything he drew looked like a worm. And Zoe taught Benny how to count in French. 1, 2, 3, 4. Benny repeated after her in a shrill little voice, mispronouncing everything, turning quatre into cat, and Zoe patiently corrected him again and again, without ever getting annoyed. Finley sat in the chair by the window, watching the 2 children, and saw something in Zoe she had never seen before. When she was beside Benny, Zoe wasn't the overly mature child who sat with her arms folded, grading adults. She was an older sister, clumsy but gentle, serious but able to laugh, caring for a younger child by instinct rather than because anyone had taught her how. That afternoon, when Benny was taking his nap, Finley and Zoe sat in the library. Zoe was rereading a small French book, its leather cover worn, its pages yellowed with age. Finley looked at the book and realized it didn't come from the library shelves. It was one of Zoe's personal belongings, something she had brought with her from Switzerland. "Who taught you French, Zoe?" It was an ordinary question, Finley asked out of curiosity, with no other intention. But Zoe stopped turning the pages. The little girl's finger stayed still on the open page, unmoving. The silence stretched long enough for Finley to understand she had touched something far deeper than a simple answer. My mother, Zoe said, her voice smaller than usual. My mother spoke French. Finley didn't rush. She didn't ask anything else right away. She only sat still, waiting, giving Zoe space. And Zoe told her. For the first time, she told someone besides her father and Oren. My mother's name was Madeline, Zoe said, her eyes still lowered to the book. She was American, but she grew up in France. She spoke French when she sang me to sleep. I can't remember the song. I only remember the sound. I remember how it sounded. The little girl paused and swallowed. I remember my mother's perfume, jasmine. Her room always smelled like jasmine. Your mother died when you were very small? Finley asked softly. Zoe nodded. I was 2. Mother went out one night and didn't come back. Father said she had an accident. Later, when I was older, I understood it wasn't an accident. She stopped. When she spoke again, her voice was flat, trying to stay controlled, but the fingers gripping the edge of the book betrayed her. That night, Father carried me onto a plane. I cried the whole time because I wanted to wait for Mother to come home. I didn't understand why Father was taking me away when Mother wasn't home yet. I kept calling for her. I kept calling for her on the plane until I fell asleep. Finley felt her chest tighten. She imagined a 2-year-old child on a night flight across the Atlantic, crying for her mother in the dark cabin of an airplane, and that mother would never come. When I arrived in Geneva, Zoe continued, I stayed with a family Father arranged for me. They were good, but they weren't Mother. No one spoke French like Mother. No one smelled like jasmine. The little girl touched the small book. This book was Mother's. Father sent it to me with a few of her things when I was 5. I read it every night. Not because I understand everything, but because when I read French, I feel like Mother is close. Then Zoe cried. Not the loud kind of crying children do. It was silent crying, tears running down her cheeks, her lips pressed tight, trying to hold it in. The kind of crying that belonged to a child who had grown used to handling her pain alone because no one had ever stayed beside her long enough for her to dare to let go. Finley said nothing. She opened her arms. Zoe looked at her for 1 second, then leaned over, buried her face against Finley's shoulder, and cried. For the first time in 6 years, the little girl cried in front of someone without being afraid of being judged, without being afraid of being sent away, without being afraid that person would vanish tomorrow. Finley held Zoe, one hand on the little girl's back, the other resting on her head. She didn't say don't cry, because she knew those words were meaningless. She didn't say I understand, because no one ever truly understands another person's pain. She only held her, stayed still, let Zoe cry until the tears stopped on their own. The boundary between tutor and student, the boundary between outsider and member of the household, the boundary Finley had tried to keep over the past days because she knew she shouldn't attach herself too deeply to a world that didn't belong to her. All of it dissolved in that moment. She was no longer Zoe's tutor. She was the person Zoe had chosen to receive the pain the little girl had kept inside her heart since she was 2. Outside the library door, Vincent stood motionless. He had been passing by, heard the crying, and stopped. His back rested against the wall, his eyes closed, his hands hanging at his sides. He listened to his daughter speak about Madeline. Listened to his daughter speak about the scent of jasmine perfume. Listened to his daughter speak about that night on the plane. The night when he himself had carried his child away from New York while his wife lay cold in the morgue. He wanted to step inside, wanted to hold his daughter, but he didn't step in. Because for the first time in 6 years, his daughter was being comforted, truly comforted. And the person who could do that was not him, not his money, not his power, not his high walls and iron gates. It was a delivery girl from Brooklyn, sitting in the library, holding his daughter with her bare hands. Vincent Ashford stood outside the door, eyes closed, and for the first time in a very long while, he didn't know whether he should feel grateful or heartbroken, perhaps both. After that afternoon in the library, everything between Vincent and Finley changed, not in a large, noisy way that everyone could recognize. It was the kind of change that was small and slow, like water soaking into stone, something only the 2 people inside it could feel. It began with coffee. Every morning, when Finley came down to the library to prepare Zoe's lesson, there was already a cup of coffee waiting on the table. The first cup, she thought Mrs. Webb had left there. But by the 3rd day, She noticed that the coffee wasn't placed on a silver tray the way Mrs. Webb served things. It sat directly on the table, beside the stack of books, without a saucer. She asked Mrs. Webb, "I didn't put it there, Miss Dawson. Mr. Ashford makes it himself every morning before he goes to his meetings." Vincent Ashford, a man who had his own chef, who had staff serving him 24 hours a day, made coffee for her with his own hands every morning without saying a word. Finley didn't mention it to him, but she began leaving books on his desk, books she found in the library that she thought he might like. A book about the history of American architecture because she had seen him often looking out the window toward the old stone dome in the mansion's east wing. A volume of Robert Frost's poetry because once, while speaking with Orrin, he had accidentally mentioned the line, "Miles to go before I sleep," and she had happened to hear it. Vincent said nothing about the books, but Finley noticed that they disappeared from his desk every evening and reappeared on the shelf in his bedroom, something Mrs. Webb happened to mention while cleaning. Then came the glances. Finley caught him looking at her during dinner while she was wiping Benny's mouth. He looked away the moment she raised her eyes, but not quickly enough. She caught him looking at her when she stood by the library window in the afternoon, sunlight slanting through her hair. That time, he didn't look away. He held her gaze for one beat longer than usual before turning to leave. And Finley realized she was looking at him, too, looking at the way he bent down to listen when Zoe spoke, patient, attentive, as though every word from his daughter mattered more than any meeting. Looking at the way he lifted Benny when the little boy grew sleepy and nodded off on the sofa after dinner, so gently that the child didn't wake. Looking at hands that had once signed death sentences in the underworld, now carefully tucking a blanket around a child who wasn't his own. She knew she shouldn't look. She knew she shouldn't feel anything. He was the master of the house. He had a fiancé. He belonged to a world that had nothing to do with her. But she couldn't stop. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, Finley went down to the library to get the book she hadn't finished reading. She didn't expect Vincent to be there. He was sitting in the leather chair beside the fireplace, a glass of liquor in his hand, reading the very Robert Frost book she had left for him. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. "I'm sorry," Finley said. "I didn't know you were here. You don't need to apologize. This is your library too." She should have turned away, taken her book and left. But instead, she sat down in the chair across from him. Maybe because she was tired. Maybe because the fire in the hearth made the room warmer than usual. Maybe because after the night at the hospital, after the afternoon Zoe had cried in her arms, the boundary between master and employee had blurred more than she wanted to admit. The silence lasted for several minutes. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was almost easy. Then Finley asked, without looking at him, her eyes fixed on the flames, "Do you love your fiancé?" That question had no right to be asked. She knew it. He knew it. But she had asked it. Vincent was silent for 3 beats. No. One word. No explanation. No defense. Finley turned to look at him. "Then why marry her?" "Because that is how my world works. An alliance between 2 families. Her father controls the Boston route. I need that route. She needs the position. It's an arrangement." "An arrangement," Finley repeated, unable to hide the bitterness in her voice. "You're trading the rest of your life for a shipping route. You don't understand this world. Maybe not, but I understand this. That isn't how the world works. That is how the world wants you to believe it works. So you'll never ask yourself whether you have the right to choose differently." No one spoke to Vincent Ashford that way. Not subordinates, not advisors, not allies. No one in his world dared to question the logic he used to run everything. But the girl sitting across from him, the delivery girl from Bushwick, the girl who had nothing but her hands and her will, had just done exactly that, in a voice as calm as if she were commenting on the weather. Vincent set down his glass. He stood, walked toward her. Finley didn't rise. She looked up at him from the chair. Her heart was beating fast, but she didn't move back. He stopped right in front of her, close enough for her to feel the warmth from his body. Then he raised his hand, slowly, and placed his finger against her cheekbone, the place where Paige had slapped her. The mark had healed long ago, leaving no trace. But his finger touched that exact spot, as if he had memorized the precise place, as if he had never forgotten it. Finley held her breath. "I'm not like you," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "I don't belong to this world." Vincent looked at her. The firelight danced in those gray-blue eyes, and for the first time, Finley didn't see coldness there. She saw something burning, slow and deep, held down for far too long. "No," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're not like me. You're not like anyone who has ever stepped into this house, and that is why I can't stop thinking about you." He withdrew his hand, took one step back. Then he turned and walked out of the library without looking back, as if one more second there would make him do something neither of them could undo. Finley remained sitting alone in the firelight, her hand lifted to touch her cheekbone, the place his finger had just touched. Her skin was still warm. She knew she should be afraid, should be rational, should remember who he was, who she was, and how far the distance between their two worlds truly stretched. But she wasn't afraid. And that was the most frightening thing of all. Outside, the night wind moved across the mansion grounds. The boundary they had both kept for weeks, through politeness, through distance, through the words Mr. and Miss, had been crossed tonight. And neither of them wanted to return to the other side. Grant Whitmore arrived at the Ashford mansion on Friday afternoon without warning. A black Bentley drove straight through the gates without needing anyone to open them, because Paige had called the security team in advance to say her father was coming. Orrin learned about it later than he would have liked, and that was enough for the former Special Forces operative to understand that Paige was playing on her own field. Grant stepped out of the car, 62 years old, his silver hair combed back to perfection, wearing a gray three-piece suit tailored by his private tailor in Boston, his Oxford shoes polished so brightly they reflected the afternoon sunlight. He looked like a retired senator. That was the mask he had spent 30 years carefully building. Beneath that mask was the man who controlled every shipping route from Boston down through all of New England, the man who had buried at least 4 rivals without ever getting a single drop of blood on his own hands because he always had someone else do it for him. Vincent received Grant in the grand dining room, a formal dinner, white candles, silverware, French wine, Mrs. Webb brought up from the cellar. Paige sat beside her father, perfectly dressed, perfectly smiling, playing the part of the obedient daughter and flawless fiancée beyond reproach. Vincent sat at the head of the table, Orrin standing behind him. Dinner passed smoothly, filled entirely with polite conversation about real estate, the market, and the autumn weather in Westchester. No one mentioned the underworld at the dinner table. That was the rule. Then Benny ran past. The little boy was chasing Zoe down the hallway, both of them laughing loudly, and Benny dashed into the dining room before Zoe could stop him. He froze when he saw the unfamiliar adults, his eyes round, then turned and ran back out, less than 5 seconds, but long enough for Grant to see. He didn't ask right away. He was a man who knew how to wait. Dinner ended. Paige withdrew to her room, and Vincent invited Grant into the study for whiskey. The two men sat across from each other, glasses in hand, and only then did Grant begin. The boy who just ran through the dining room. Whose child is he? The son of Zoe's tutor. The tutor. Grant took a sip of whiskey, his voice still gentle, as if he were asking about the weather. Paige told me about the delivery girl you hired to teach the child. Finley Dawson, correct? Vincent didn't answer. He knew Grant already knew the name. The question wasn't really a question. I was curious, Grant continued, turning the glass in his hand. So I had someone do a brief check. Old habit. You understand, in our line of work, anyone who gets close to our family is someone we need to know. Vincent remained silent, but his eyes narrowed. The boy's father is Tristan Mercer. Grant stopped at exactly the right moment, letting the name hang in the air. Hugh Mercer's son. Silence. The heavy, dense kind of silence that comes before a storm. Vincent knew that name. He had known it from the first day he read Finley's file. But he had never told Grant. And now Grant knew. You're keeping a woman with a direct connection to Hugh Mercer inside your home, Grant said, setting his glass down, his voice still soft, but his eyes were not. Hugh Mercer, the man who stole $40 million from your family and disappeared 5 years ago. She could be a planted piece, Vincent. She could be the link that leads you to Hugh, or worse, leads Hugh to you. She knows nothing about Hugh Mercer, Vincent said, his voice flat. Are you certain? Or do you want to be certain? Grant leaned forward. I'm not judging. I only want to protect our alliance. My daughter is about to become your wife. If there's a security risk in this house, I need to know that you see it. Vincent didn't answer. He looked at Grant, knowing exactly what the man was doing. Grant didn't care about security. Grant cared that Finley was standing between Paige and Vincent, and he wanted her removed from the picture. But the name Mercer was real. The connection was real. And even though Vincent had checked it himself, even though he had concluded that Finley was innocent, the seed of doubt Grant had just planted was not the kind of seed that could be pulled out easily. It would lie there, waiting for the right moment to sprout. At the same time, in the small tea room in the west wing of the mansion, Paige found Finley. She knocked, then stepped inside with a smile Finley had never seen before, the kind of smile that looked like a velvet-wrapped blade. "I think we should talk, woman to woman," Paige said, sitting down in the chair across from Finley and crossing her legs elegantly. "I have nothing against you, Finley, truly. You take good care of Zoe, but I think there are things you should know before you sink any deeper into this house." Finley looked at Paige, silent, waiting. "Do you know who Benny's father is? Beyond the fact that he left you?" "I don't think that's any of your business. Normally, it wouldn't be, but when you're living in the home of a man who has been hunting your son's father's family, it becomes everyone's business." Finley froze. Paige continued, her voice still gentle, almost sympathetic, but her eyes were cold and sharp. "Tristan Mercer, Hugh Mercer's son. Hugh was once the closest man to the Ashford family. 5 years ago, he betrayed them, stole $40 million, then vanished with his son. Vincent has been hunting them for 5 years. And you, Finley, you're the mother of Hugh Mercer's grandson, sitting at the same table with the man who wants to find him more than anything else in this world." Finley couldn't speak. She heard every word, and every word drove into her like a nail. Tristan, the name she had spent 4 years trying to forget. He hadn't only left her, he had run. Run with his father, left her pregnant and alone, not because he was a coward in love, but because he was a coward in something far larger. "I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know the truth," Paige said, rising and smoothing her dress. "Vincent knows this. He's known from the beginning. You should ask yourself why he's keeping you here." Paige walked out and closed the door gently behind her. Finley sat alone in the tea room, both hands clenched tightly on her lap. She thought about the apartment in Bushwick, about the nights she had slept holding Benny, about all the times she had wondered why Tristan had disappeared without a word. Now she had her answer. And that answer dragged another question behind it, one far more terrifying. Vincent had known from the beginning. He had known who she was, known that Benny was the grandson of his enemy, and he had still kept her here. Why? Because of Zoe? Because she was the link that could lead to Hugh? Or because of something else he had said in the library last night? Finley looked down at her trembling hands, and for the first time since she had stepped through the iron gate, she felt afraid. Not afraid of Vincent. Afraid of the truth that she was living in the middle of a chess game whose rules she didn't know, and every piece around her was moving in ways she couldn't see. Finley waited until the children were asleep. She tucked the blanket around Benny, checked that Zoe had turned off the light, then went downstairs to the first floor. It was close to 11 o'clock at night. The mansion was silent, except for the sound of her footsteps on the hardwood floor. Light spilled from the crack beneath Vincent's study door. She didn't knock. She pushed it open and walked straight in. Vincent was sitting behind his desk, his laptop open, a glass of liquor near his hand. He looked up, and from just one look at Finley's face, he knew she knew. "You knew who Tristan was from the beginning." It wasn't a question. Finley's voice was flat, controlled, but her eyes were burning. She had spent the entire afternoon sitting in her room, piecing everything together, and now she stood here with the complete picture, with not one piece of it she wanted to see. Vincent closed the laptop. He didn't lie. "I knew." "Since when?" "Since the morning after the first day you came here. Orrin brought me the file. I read the name Tristan Mercer and knew he was Hugh's son." Finley bit her lip. She had suspected it, but hearing him confirm, it still felt like being punched in the chest. "Then why did you keep me here? Because of Zoe? Or because I'm a link that could lead you to Hugh Mercer?" Vincent stood, stepped out from behind the desk, but didn't come close to her. He stood beside the window, his back turned slightly toward her, looking out over the dark grounds. "At first, both." Finley drew in a sharp breath. "Both. Logic said, you had a connection to my enemy. Keeping you within sight was reasonable. At the same time, Zoe chose you. and I had no reason to refuse what my daughter wanted. Logic, Finley repeated, bitterness in her voice. So that night at the hospital, when you sat beside Benny all night, was that logic? The coffee you make for me every morning, is that logic too? Last night in the library, when you touched my face and said you couldn't stop thinking about me, was that also strategy? Vincent turned back to look at her, and Finley saw something she knew very few people in the world had ever seen. The steel on his face cracked, not with a loud break. Only a small, deep fracture, at the corner of his eyes, in the line of his jaw clenched too tightly, in the way he swallowed before he spoke. At first, it was logic. His voice was lower than usual, but it hasn't been logic for a long time. Since when? I don't know exactly. Maybe from the moment you knelt down and asked whether my daughter was all right, without needing to know who she was. Maybe from the moment you answered every one of Zoe's questions without lying once. Maybe from that night at the hospital when you cried and I realized it was the first time you had allowed anyone to see you weak. He stopped. I don't know the exact moment. I only know that by the time I realized it, it was already too late. Finley said nothing. She wanted to believe him. Some part of her, the part that had seen him carry Benny, had seen him kneel before Zoe, had felt his finger against her cheekbone the night before, wanted to believe so badly it hurt. But another part of her, the part Tristan had abandoned, the part that had grown up in foster care and learned through pain that no one gave you anything for free, would not let her believe easily. I need to know clearly, she said, her voice trembling but not breaking. Am I here because of Zoe? Because you need to watch me? Or because of some other reason? Vincent stepped forward. One step, only one. Close enough for her to see the desk lamp reflected in his eyes. Close enough for her to realize he was holding something back too. You're here because my daughter chose you, and I trust my daughter more than any file. He paused, his voice dropping even lower. You're here because your son brought this house back to life, because his laughter in the hallway is something this place hasn't had in 6 years. One beat of silence. And because I don't want you to leave. 12 words. He spoke them without flourish, without romance, without any promise attached. He spoke them like truth, the same way he had said no when she asked whether he loved Paige, the same voice, the same bare honesty he seemed to reserve only for her in empty rooms late at night. Finley looked at him. There were too many things in her eyes at once. Anger, exhaustion, fear, and something softer she didn't want to name, because naming it would make everything 100 times more complicated. She said nothing more. She turned, walked out of the study, and closed the door behind her. She didn't slam it. She only shut it gently, almost without a sound. But the silence after the door closed was heavier than any words could have been. Vincent stood alone in the study, looking at the closed door. He didn't follow her. He knew she needed time. He also knew that tonight he had told the truth, all of it, holding nothing back. And that truth might make her stay, or it might make her leave forever. He didn't know which outcome would come, but for the first time in many years, Vincent Ashford was afraid of losing something that had nothing to do with money, power, or empire. He was afraid of losing her. 3 days after the confrontation in the study, when Finley still didn't know whether she should stay or leave, when she and Vincent were still avoiding each other with distances, just polite enough in the hallways and at meals, her phone vibrated at 10 o'clock at night. An unknown number, a short message. Finn, I know where you are. I need to see you. Because of Benny. Finley read the message twice, 3 times. She recognized the sender before she had even finished reading the first sentence. There was only one person in the world who called her Finn. Tristan Mercer. The man who had left her when she was 7 months pregnant, vanished without a word, and let her give birth alone in a public hospital in Brooklyn with not a single relative in the waiting room. 4 years of silence. And now, right when she was living in the house of his father's enemy, he appeared. Finley knew she should tell Vincent. After that night in the study, after everything he had said, she should tell him, but she didn't. Because if Vincent knew Tristan had contacted her, he would find Tristan. And finding Tristan meant finding Hugh. And Hugh Mercer, even if he was a traitor, even if he had stolen $40 million, was still Benny's biological grandfather. Her 4-year-old son knew nothing about the underworld, knew nothing about who his grandfather was, and Finley wanted to keep it that way. She texted back, where? Main Street Cafe, Terrytown, tomorrow, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Come alone. The next day, Finley told Mrs. Webb that she needed to go out and buy a few personal things. She called a taxi, the only thing she could call because she didn't have a car. The taxi took her to Terrytown, a small town about 20 minutes from the mansion. The cafe sat on a quiet corner with few customers. Tristan was sitting at the last table, a baseball cap pulled low, wearing a loose coat. When she sat down across from him, she almost didn't recognize him. The Tristan Mercer she had once known had been tall, confident, with an easy smile that had made her 19-year-old self believe he would stay. The man in front of her now was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his skin gray, his gaze constantly shifting toward the window as if he were waiting for someone to walk in and arrest him. "You look different," Tristan said. "4 years will do that to a person," Finley replied. "Not warm, not cold, just the truth." Tristan didn't circle around it. "My father is sick, badly. The doctors say he won't make it through the winter. He wants to meet Benny, see his grandson once before he dies," Finley said bluntly, because she had no patience for unfinished sentences. "Before he dies." Finley looked at him. 4 years. You knew I was pregnant. You knew I gave birth. You didn't call, didn't write, didn't send $1. And now you come because your father wants to meet his grandson. I know I don't deserve it. That's right, you don't. But that isn't the question I want to ask." Finley leaned forward, her voice lowering. "The question I want to ask is this. How did you know I was at the Ashford mansion?" Tristan avoided her eyes. "I have someone I know." "Who?" Silence. "Tristan, who told you where I was?" "A man contacted me about a week ago. Said he knew you were in Vincent Ashford's house. Said if I wanted to see you and Benny, he could arrange it." "Name?" "He didn't give a name, but he mentioned that his daughter was about to marry Ashford. Grant Whitmore." Finley closed her eyes. Everything became clear as daylight. Grant had found out where Tristan and Hugh were hiding, hadn't told Vincent, had kept it secret, and had used Tristan as a chess piece. The purpose: draw Finley out of the mansion, create a scandal, break the bond between her and Vincent, and make sure Paige's wedding happened. Finley opened her eyes and looked at Tristan. "You know you're being used, don't you?" Tristan didn't answer. He knew, but he was too tired, too afraid, too weak to do anything except follow the instructions of anyone who held out a hand. Just like 5 years ago, when he had run after his father without looking back. Finley stood up. "I'll think about Hugh, but don't contact me again. If I decide, I'll find you." She left the cafe and called a taxi back to the mansion. Her heart felt heavy as stone. She had hidden it from Vincent. She knew she shouldn't have. But she couldn't find any other way to protect Benny from becoming a pawn in the game between two families. She didn't know she had been followed from the moment she stepped outside the mansion gates. Oren didn't follow Finley because he didn't trust her. He followed because that was his job. The security cameras recorded her calling a taxi. The GPS system tracked her to Terrytown. And a security employee recorded the scene of her sitting across from Tristan Mercer inside the cafe through the window. Oren placed the photograph on Vincent's desk at 7 o'clock that evening. Vincent looked at the photograph. His face didn't change, but his hand gripped the edge of the desk until his knuckles went white. "Call her down here." Finley walked into the study and knew at once. The air in the room was different, colder, heavier. Vincent sat behind the desk, the photograph of her and Tristan placed face down in front of him. He wasn't loudly angry. He was angry in silence. The kind of anger Finley imagined made men in the underworld lose sleep for many nights. "You met Tristan Mercer this afternoon." It wasn't a question. Finley didn't deny it. "Yes." "You didn't tell me." "Yes." "Why?" Finley looked at him. She knew she had been wrong to hide it. She knew that in his world, withholding information was the same as betrayal. But she wasn't part of his world. "Because if I told you, you would find Hugh. And whatever Hugh is, he's still Benny's grandfather. I can't let my son lose the last blood relative he has on his father's side just because you need revenge. This isn't revenge. This is security. To you, it's security. To me, it's my son." She took one step forward, her voice rising, and for the first time, she spoke without control, everything she had been holding and spilling out. "I'm not a spy. I'm not a pawn. I don't know anything about $40 million or any family. I'm just a mother trying to keep my child safe in the middle of a world I don't belong to." Her voice broke on the last word. She turned her face away, not wanting him to see. Her eyes were red. Vincent was silent. He looked at Finley, looked at her trembling shoulders, looked at her hand clenched tight at her side, and he thought of the night at the hospital, of her voice whispering, "I have no one." She hadn't betrayed him. She had protected her child in the only way she knew how. He turned over the photograph and looked at it again. Tristan sat across from Finley, thin and frightened. And behind Tristan, the invisible thread led back to Grant Whitmore. Grant knew where Hugh was. Grant had kept it secret. Grant had used Tristan to break him from the inside. An ally was more dangerous than an enemy. Vincent picked up the phone and called Oren. "I need to know every contact Grant Whitmore has had over the past 3 months. Every call, every meeting, every transaction. Everything." Finley stood by the door, not knowing whether she should stay or go. Vincent looked at her, his voice no longer as cold as when she had walked in, but not warm either. "You stay inside the mansion. Don't go out. For your safety." She nodded, turned away, walked up the stairs, and at the top of the stairs, Zoe was sitting there. The little girl was wearing pajamas, hugging a pillow, her eyes watching Finley from above. Finley didn't know how long she had been sitting there. "Are you going to leave?" Zoe asked, her voice small, no longer mature, no longer sharp, only the voice of an 8-year-old child. "Afraid of losing one more person." Finley sat down beside Zoe on the stair, pulling the little girl into her arms. "I don't know, Zoe." Zoe was silent for a long time. Then she said, her face buried against Finley's shoulder, "If you leave, I lose one more person." The little girl paused. "And so does father." Finley held Zoe tighter, resting her chin on the top of the little girl's head, and said nothing. Because she didn't know what to say when an 8-year-old child spoke the truth. Both adults were too afraid to admit. The ultimatum came through a phone call at 7 o'clock in the morning. Grant Whitmore wasn't a man who circled around anything. 2 weeks, Vincent. The wedding happens in 2 weeks, or the alliance between Ashford and Whitmore ends. Vincent stood in the study, the phone pressed to his ear, looking out the window. Outside, Zoe and Benny were playing in the garden under the watch of a security employee. "And if I refuse?" he asked, his voice flat. "If you refuse, I pull the entire Boston route. You lose access to every shipping channel from New England down. And I know you're thinking you can rebuild that route, but that will take 2 years and a great deal of blood." Grant paused for a beat. "But that isn't the part you should worry about most. Go on. Hugh Mercer. I know where he is. You searched for him for 5 years and found nothing. I found him in 3 weeks. If the alliance ends, I hand Hugh to the FBI. Not to you. To the FBI." Vincent understood at once. Hugh Mercer knew far too much about the internal operations of the Ashford family. If the FBI arrested Hugh, he would talk in exchange for a lighter sentence. That was how the American justice system worked. And when Hugh talked, the FBI would open a RICO investigation, the law against organized crime. Everything Vincent had built, from the financial front of his empire to the underground network beneath it, would be turned inside out, not with bullets or knives. With paperwork, with court orders, with federal investigators. 2 weeks, Grant repeated. "I'll send the invitations." The call ended. Vincent set the phone down. He stood still for a very long moment, watching the 2 children play in the garden. Then he called Oren in. "The report on Grant's contacts. Is it ready?" Oren placed a thick file on the desk. The results of the investigation into 3 months of Grant Whitmore's communications, and inside it was something Vincent had suspected but hadn't yet had proof of. Paige Whitmore, during the entire time she had lived inside the Ashford mansion, had been sending internal information to her father. Vincent's travel schedule, the list of people coming in and out of the mansion, the names of private meetings, even a diagram of the security system that she had drawn from her daily observations. A spy. Inside his own house. In the very bed he had allowed her to sleep in. Vincent closed the file. His face didn't change, but Oren, who had walked beside him for 15 years, recognized the sign. The vein on Vincent's neck stood out, and when he spoke, his voice was reduced to a whisper. That was when Vincent was most dangerous. "Arrange a table at Del Posto. Tonight, private room, Grant and me. Just the 2 of us." At the same time, Paige went to find Finley one final time. She knocked on Finley's door in the middle of the afternoon while Benny was taking his nap. Finley opened the door and knew at once from Paige's eyes that this was not a social visit. "I came to say goodbye," Paige said, leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her chest. "Not my goodbye, yours. I don't understand." "You will. My father called Vincent this morning. Everything has been decided. The wedding will happen. And you, Finley, will go back to Brooklyn, back to your fifth-floor apartment with no elevator, back to your morning and afternoon delivery shifts, back to your small little life." Paige tilted her head, her voice almost sympathetic, though her eyes were cold. "Don't be sad. You had a beautiful month, more than what life would have otherwise given you." Finley looked at Paige. She didn't tremble. She didn't flush. She didn't explode with anger. She only looked straight into the eyes of the woman across from her and said in a voice so calm that Paige had to blink, "If I leave, that will be my decision. Not yours, not your father's, and not anyone else's in the world you think you own." Paige straightened her back, and the smile vanished. "You'll regret saying that. Maybe. But at least it'll be my regret, not someone else's." Paige turned away. That was the last conversation between the two women. That night, Vincent sat across from Grant Whitmore in a private room at Del Posto in Manhattan. 2 glasses of whiskey sat on the table. Neither man drank. Grant opened with a smile. "I'm glad you agreed to meet. I assume you've thought about my proposal." "I have thought," Vincent said, placing a file on the table and pushing it toward Grant, "but not about the wedding." Grant looked at the file, opened it, and for the first time in his seasoned life, Grant Whitmore's face changed color. Inside was all the evidence. The messages Paige had sent her father, screenshots, call records, the security diagram Paige had drawn, the list of internal Ashford family information she had passed to Grant during the entire time she lived in the mansion. "Your daughter?" Vincent said, his voice low and slow, as though counting out every word, "is a spy. In my house, at my dinner table, beside my daughter." Grant closed the file. He was silent for 10 seconds, calculating. Then he tried. "Vincent, this is a misunderstanding." Paige was only sharing ordinary concerns with her father. "A diagram of my home security system," Vincent cut in, "is not an ordinary concern." Silence. "The alliance ends here, Grant. Not because of the delivery girl, not because of Hugh Mercer, but because you planted your daughter in my house to steal information. Exactly the same way Hugh Mercer stole money from my family 5 years ago. You and he are no different." Grant tightened his jaw. "You understand the consequences, don't you? The Boston route, the FBI, Rico." "I understand." Vincent stood. "And I accept them. I lost my wife because I couldn't protect her. I won't lose anyone else because I chose the wrong ally." He walked out of the private room without looking back. The next morning, Paige Whitmore packed her things in silence. No screaming, no crying, no threats. She knew her father had lost this round. She pulled her suitcase down the hallway, passing the library where Finley was teaching Zoe. She didn't look in, didn't say a word. The black Bentley was already waiting outside the gates. Paige stepped into the car. The door closed, and the car rolled through the iron gates for the last time. "Mrs." Webb stood on the front steps and watched it leave, then turned back inside and said to Orrin, in a voice Finley happened to hear as she passed by, "That is the 4th woman to leave this house." Orrin looked toward the library, where Finley was sitting beside Zoe, Benny in her lap, and said quietly, "But perhaps the last." 2 days after Paige left, the mansion was quiet in a different way. There was no longer the sharp click of high heels striking the marble floor. No longer the scent of expensive perfume drifting through the West Wing hallway. No longer the cold glance sliding over Finley each time the 2 women crossed paths. But that quiet did not bring relief. Because Finley knew the price Vincent had just paid, losing the alliance with Whitmore, losing the Boston route, facing the risk that Grant would hand Hugh over to the FBI. He had chosen to break all of it. And she didn't know whether he had broken it for her, for Zoe, or for the pride of a man who refused to accept betrayal. On the Tuesday evening after Paige left, Vincent called Finley into the study. She walked in and sat down in the chair across from his desk, the chair Zoe usually sat in. Vincent wasn't sitting behind the desk. He stood beside the window, looking out over the dark grounds, his hands in his trouser pockets. I've arranged an apartment in Manhattan, he said, his voice flat, the voice he used for business. A safe area, 2 bedrooms. Benny will have his own space. I'll support you financially until you're settled, no strings attached. Finley looked at him. You're sending me away. I'm protecting you. He turned back, and Finley saw the exhaustion on his face, the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from having to make one decision after another, each one costing him something. A war with Whitmore is coming. Grant isn't a man who accepts losing. He'll retaliate, and I don't know how. This isn't a safe place for you and Benny anymore. Where is safe for me? Finley asked. The apartment in Bushwick where the refrigerator is empty and the heat breaks every winter? Or the new apartment in Manhattan that you pay for, where I sit alone waiting for winter to pass? At least you won't be caught in this world. I was caught in this world from the moment Tristan Mercer left me with a child in my belly. I just didn't know it. Finley stood. She stepped forward, didn't sit back down, didn't keep her distance. She stood in front of Vincent, close, closer than she had ever been before, except for that night in the library. 5 years, she said, her voice not trembling, every word clear. 5 years I protected myself, raised my son alone, got sick alone, was afraid alone, lay in emergency rooms holding Benny alone before you appeared, worked 2 shifts, and came home to climb 5 flights of stairs alone, cried alone because there was no one to cry in front of. She stopped and drew a breath. For the first time in 5 years, I'm not alone. For the first time, Benny has sister Zoe. For the first time, I sleep without being afraid of next month's rent. For the first time, someone makes coffee for me every morning without me having to ask. And you want me to leave? Vincent looked at her. The distance between them was only 1 step now. I don't want to, he said, his voice hoarse and low, as if every word had to carve its own path out of his chest. I don't want you to leave, but I don't know how to keep anyone close without hurting them. Madeline stayed, and she died. Zoe stayed, and I had to send her away for 6 years. Everyone who stays near me pays a price. So you'll keep pushing everyone away forever? If I have to. And you'll sit alone in your study at 2 o'clock in the morning looking at your wife's photograph for the rest of your life? He went still. She knew. She had seen him that night. He hadn't known she had seen him, but now he did. Then don't keep me, Finley said, her voice softer, gentler, but more certain than anything she had ever said. Don't keep me. Let me choose to stay. Vincent looked at her, looked into eyes where, for the first time, he saw no fear, no hesitation, no calculation, only choice. Simple, clear, whole. He raised his hand and touched her face, this time, not with one finger brushing her cheekbone before pulling away. This time, his hand settled against her cheek, warm, heavy, staying there. Finley leaned into his palm and closed her eyes. And he kissed her. Not gently, not hesitantly, not like the first kiss in a novel. Vincent's kiss carried 6 years of loneliness, carried the pain he had buried beneath steel, carried the hunger of a man who had forgotten how to touch someone without fearing he would lose them. And Finley's kiss carried 5 years of standing on her own, carried every night she had lain, holding Benny in a dark apartment, and wondered whether life would ever give her anything more. When they parted, both of them were breathing hard. Vincent rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed. Stay. I already told you. I'm choosing for myself. 1 week later, Vincent did something Orrin had not expected. He allowed Benny to meet Hugh Mercer. Orrin had found Hugh in a small house in Burlington, Vermont, bedridden, with terminal cancer, with only a few weeks left. Tristan was there taking care of his father. Why? Orrin asked directly, one of the rare times he questioned Vincent's decision. Because the 4-year-old boy is innocent, Vincent answered. And because she taught me that taking revenge on a dying old man in front of his grandson doesn't make me stronger, it only makes me like the people I despise. Orrin drove Finley and Benny to Vermont under the escort of 2 security employees. Vincent did not go with them. There were boundaries he still could not cross, and sitting beside Hugh Mercer's bed was one of them. Hugh Mercer lay on the bed, once 80 kilograms and now less than 50, his skin yellowed, his hands trembling. When Finley carried Benny into the room, the old man looked at the child with eyes that had gone cloudy but suddenly brightened. This is my grandson? Benny looked at the unfamiliar old man, shy, clinging to his mother's hand. Finley knelt beside her son. Benny, this is your grandfather. He's sick, so speak gently, all right? Benny stepped forward, tilted his head as he looked at Hugh, then placed his tiny hand on the old man's hand. Grandpa, do you want to see my drawing? I can draw a very beautiful worm. Hugh Mercer cried. Not from pain, because he had had a grandson for 4 years and had never been allowed to meet him, because his wrong choices had taken this chance away until it was almost too late. Tristan stood in the corner, his eyes red, not daring to look at Finley. She didn't look at him either. She hadn't come here for Tristan. She had come for Benny. Hugh Mercer died 2 weeks after meeting his grandson. Tristan called Finley to tell her. Finley listened in silence, then said, I'm sorry. And she truly was sorry, not for the traitor, but for an old man who died far from home, with his only beautiful final memory being a picture of a worm his grandson had drawn for him. After the funeral, Vincent sent Tristan a message through Oren. He was allowed to leave, without being hunted, on the condition that he never came back, never contacted Finley or Benny, and never appeared anywhere along the east coast of the United States. Tristan agreed. He disappeared for the second time, and this time, Finley felt nothing. No pain, no anger, no relief, only that it was over. That evening, Finley and Vincent stood in the second-floor hallway outside Zoe's room. Inside, Zoe was reading to Benny in French. Benny didn't understand a single word but lay there listening, absorbed, because Sister Zoe's voice when she read French sounded like singing. You're not a monster, Finley said softly, her eyes looking through the crack in the door at the 2 children. You let a dying old man meet his grandson. You spared the man who betrayed your family. Monsters don't do that. Vincent stood beside her, his shoulder nearly touching hers, looking in the same direction. I'm still a monster, he said. I still do things you don't want to know about. I'll never become a good man in the way you define it. I don't need you to become a good man. Then what do you need? Finley turned to look at him. I need you to become you. That's all. Vincent looked at her, and one corner of his mouth lifted. Half a smile, Finley had begun to learn how to read. You make me want to become a better kind of monster, he said. Finley didn't smile. She only leaned her head against his shoulder, lightly, naturally, as if she had done it 100 times before. And he let her lean. Inside the room, Zoe secretly looked out through the narrow crack in the door and saw her father standing beside Finley, shoulder to shoulder, in the empty hallway. The little girl smiled, pulled the blanket up for Benny, then turned back to her mother's French book. The final move. The game was nearly won. 1 year later, the Ashford mansion still stood there. Gray stone, high walls, iron gates. Seen from the outside, nothing had changed. But once you stepped through those gates, everything was different. Fresh flowers in every room. Not the kind of flowers arranged by a decorating company under a monthly contract like in Paige's time. They were flowers Zoe and Benny picked from the back garden, placed into vases in the sweet, messy way children did things. Some flowers tall, some short, leaves tucked between them, and sometimes even weeds mixed in because Benny couldn't tell flowers from grass. Books were scattered across every flat surface. Zoe's French books on the library table, Benny's coloring books on the living room sofa, Finley's cookbooks in the kitchen, their pages dusted with flour and toys everywhere. Plastic cars beneath the dining table, a stuffed bear on Vincent's study chair that Benny had forgotten after the last time he went in to ask his father for candy. The chess set Zoe was teaching Benny to play, even though the 5-year-old still called the knight the horse and tried to ride the king piece. Laughter rang through the hallways every day, not occasionally, every day. Benny's voice calling, Sister Zoe, wait for me, as he ran after the older girl whose legs were shorter but whose will was longer. Zoe reading aloud in French to Benny, patiently correcting his pronunciation for the 100th time without ever getting annoyed. Finley singing softly in the kitchen while she cooked, a song whose words were not clear, but Mrs. Webb said it was the song Finley's mother used to sing. Zoe was 9 now. She was still smarter than most adults in the room, still had gray blue eyes that read people as if reading books. But she laughed more, laughed at the right age, laughed the way a 9-year-old child should laugh, not like a child forced to grow old too soon because she had lived away from her father for 6 years. This afternoon, Zoe sat at the library table, teaching Benny how to write his name in French. Benny held the pencil in his whole fist, his tongue sticking out in concentration, carefully shaping each letter. Benny. In French, it's still spelled the same. You just read it differently. You say Benny. Benny, Benny repeated, grinning. Sister Zoe, write your name. Zoe wrote her name, then added beneath it, Ashford. Benny looked at it. You have the same last name as Father Vincent? Zoe smiled and rubbed Benny's head. Yes, same as father. Benny didn't ask anything else. To a 5-year-old boy, everything was simple. Sister Zoe was his sister. Father Vincent was his father. Mom was mom. This was home. No further explanation was needed. Finley was no longer the delivery girl. 3 months earlier, she had begun managing the charity foundation Vincent had established at her suggestion, supporting single mothers and children in the foster care system in New York. She knew that system from the inside, knew what it lacked, where it was broken, where it hurt. She used her own pain to build something meaningful. Vincent hired a private tutor to teach her financial management and nonprofit operations, not because he wanted to turn her into a different version of herself, but because she wanted to learn. She refused to sit still. She refused to become a lady of the house who only arranged flowers and attended parties. She wanted to work, and he respected that. In the afternoon, when Vincent walked into the kitchen, his tie loosened, his briefcase still in hand, Benny ran over and hugged his leg. Father Vincent, look, I wrote my name in French. He set the briefcase down, lifted the little boy with one arm, naturally, without awkwardness, as if he had done this all his life. The boy wrapped his arms around Vincent's neck, held out the paper to show him, and Vincent looked at the crooked letters with eyes that 1 year ago no one would have thought could look at anything with such tenderness. Beautiful son, he said. Son. He had been calling Benny his son since the 6th month. No one told him to. No one suggested it. One evening, Benny fell on the stairs, scraped his knee, and cried. And Vincent lifted the boy into his arms and said, It's all right, son. Father is here, before he had time to think. Since then, Benny had called him Father Vincent, and he had never corrected him. Zoe stood at the kitchen doorway, looking at her father holding Benny, looking at Finley standing beside the stove, wiping her hands on her apron and smiling. The little girl smiled too, the satisfied smile of someone who had played a very long game of chess and knew she had won. The game had begun on the day she pretended to be the maid's daughter and watched a delivery girl walk in and protect her from a woman the entire mansion feared. The game ended here, in the kitchen, with laughter, the smell of food, and her father holding a child who did not share his blood, but shared his home. That night, after the children were asleep, Vincent led Finley out onto the 2nd-floor balcony. It was autumn, the air cool, the trees across the grounds turning gold beneath the moonlight. The mansion below glowed with warm lights. Light spilled from the children's bedroom, from the kitchen where Mrs. Webb was cleaning up, from the living room where Orrin sat reading the newspaper and pretending not to notice the 2 people on the balcony. I have something, Vincent said, taking a small black velvet box from his coat pocket. Finley looked at the box, then at him. You're not good at things like this, she said, repeating something he had once told her. No, I'm not good at them, but you taught me that not being good doesn't mean I shouldn't try. He opened the box. The ring was simple, white gold, with one small stone. Not a diamond the size of a fingertip, which a man with Vincent's wealth could easily have bought. He had chosen it because he had learned that Finley did not need anything showy. She needed the truth. I won't promise an easy life, he said, his voice low and slow, choosing every word. I'm still who I am. There are still enemies, still shadows, still nights when I can't sleep. He paused. But you gave my daughter someone to trust. You gave your son a home. You gave this house laughter. And you gave me. He swallowed, his jaw tightening, then releasing. You gave me a reason to want to come home every night. Finley looked at the ring, looked at him. The gray-blue eyes that had been so cold when she first met him that she thought nothing could ever warm them were now looking at her with something it had taken her a very long time to dare to name. Love. Not love from novels, not perfect love without scars. It was the love of 2 people life had beaten raw, 2 people who had lost, had feared, had built walls around themselves, and still chose to open the door for each other. I chose to stay a long time ago, she said. He slid the ring onto her finger. His hand did not tremble. For the first time, his hand did not tremble when he touched her. Below the balcony, the Ashford mansion stood silent in the autumn night. The iron gates were still high. The walls were still thick. The cameras were still in every corner. But inside, beyond those gates, warm light shone through every window. The smell of food still lingered from the kitchen. A French book lay open on the library table. A drawing of a worm was taped to the refrigerator. And two children slept deeply in rooms beside each other. One 9-year-old holding the hand of one 5-year-old through the gap between their beds. The Ashford mansion was no longer a fortress. It was home. And sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is not fight, not run away, but simply choose to stay. Our story ends here, but its meaning does not. This is the story of a girl who had nothing but courage, a man who believed he had lost the ability to love, and an 8-year-old girl wise enough to know that her father did not need more power, he needed more love. In real life, we also face moments when we must choose between safety and staying, between protecting ourselves and opening our hearts, between running because we are afraid and standing still because we believe. Not everyone is a mafia boss or a delivery girl, but everyone knows what loneliness feels like, what it means to fear losing someone, and what it feels like the first time you find someone who makes you want to stay. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button so we know you were here. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss new stories every day. We would love to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever had a moment in life when you had to choose between leaving and staying? Leave a comment below. Share what you feel from the bottom of your heart. We read every line and treasure every story you tell. We wish all of you watching this video very good health, a happy life, and peace every single day. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.